In the grand Blackthorn Hall, a glittering dinner hides dark secrets. When a mysterious guest vanishes into the night, leaving only a cufflink and a cryptic note signed E, Miss Jane Marple steps into a web of lies, greed, and murder. With a locked door, a circle of suspects, and clues that whisper of betrayal, can her little grey cells unravel the truth before another life is lost? Dive into a classic mystery where every detail matters, and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Hall. In the drowsy village of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with autumn's last defiance, and the church clock ticked with unhurried certainty, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly. The October light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn rug. A letter, its envelope embossed with a crest, lay open on the table beside her. It was an invitation, penned in the elegant hand of Lady Eleanor Blackthorn, requesting Miss Marple's presence at a weekend gathering at Blackthorn Hall, a sprawling estate 2 miles beyond the village. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, scanned the letter again. "How curious," she murmured, her fingers pausing mid-stitch. Lady Eleanor, a widow of considerable wealth and impeccable reputation, was not known for hosting frivolous gatherings. The invitation mentioned a small, select party to discuss matters of mutual interest, yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet sins of village life, sensed an undercurrent of unease beneath the polite phrasing. The guest list, enclosed on a separate sheet, was intriguing. Sir Henry Ashford, a retired diplomat with a penchant for rare books; Mrs. Clara Wentworth, a glamorous actress whose third marriage had recently dissolved; Dr. Lionel Gray, a reserved physician with a practice in London; Mr. Victor Crane, a financier rumoured to be facing ruin; Miss Sylvia Lang, a young heiress with a sharp tongue; and Mr. Edward Marsh, Lady Eleanor's solicitor, known for his discretion. A seventh guest, a Mr. Julian Drake, was described only as a gentleman of independent means. Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Independent means," she mused. How often that phrase conceals a multitude of secrets. A deference that bordered on nervousness. The hall's interior was opulent yet oppressive, with dark oak panelling and portraits of stern-faced blackthorns glaring from the walls. A fire crackled in the drawing-room, where the guests were assembling for pre-dinner drinks. Lady Eleanor, tall and regal in black velvet, welcomed Miss Marple with warmth that seemed slightly strained. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. I trust the journey was not too taxing." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her eyes taking in the room. Sir Henry stood by the fireplace, polishing his monocle and discussing rare manuscripts with Dr. Gray, who nodded absently. Mrs. Wentworth, resplendent in emerald silk, laughed too loudly at something Victor Crane said, though his smile was tight. Miss Lang, seated on a settee, flicked through a magazine with evident boredom, while Edward Marsh hovered near Lady Eleanor, his briefcase never far from his side. Julian Drake, the mysterious gentleman, leaned against a bookcase, his dark eyes watching the room with an intensity Miss Marple found unsettling. Dinner was announced at precisely 8 o'clock. The dining room, lit by a chandelier that cast flickering shadows, was set with gleaming silver and crystal. The conversation began pleasantly enough. Sir Henry recounted a diplomatic anecdote, and Mrs. Wentworth charmed with tales of the stage, but Miss Marple noted small discords. Victor Crane's hand trembled as he reached for his wine. Miss Lang's sharp retort to a compliment from Dr. Gray silenced the table for a moment. And Julian Drake, seated opposite Miss Marple, spoke little, his gaze darting between Lady Eleanor and Edward Marsh. As the soup course was cleared, Lady Eleanor rose, her face pale. "My friends," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I have invited you here for more than mere pleasantries. There is a matter, a delicate matter, that requires our attention. Tomorrow, after breakfast, we shall discuss it in full." A murmur rippled through the guests. Miss Marple, sipping her water, observed the reactions. Sir Henry's raised eyebrow, Mrs. Wentworth's nervous laugh, Dr. Gray's sudden stillness. Julian Drake's fingers tightened around his glass, and Edward Marsh's eyes flickered toward his hostess with something like alarm. The meal continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. By the time dessert was served, a rich chocolate tort, Miss Marple sensed a storm. Turned back to the room, her mind cataloguing every detail. At midnight, a scream shattered the silence of Blackthorn Hall. It came from the direction of the terrace. Miss Marple, already in her nightgown but not yet asleep, slipped on her dressing gown and moved swiftly to the landing. Hawkins, the butler, was already there, his face ashen. "It's Mr. Drake," he stammered. "He's gone. Vanished." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Vanished, you say?" she murmured. "How very interesting." Chapter 2. The Empty Terrace. The scream still echoed in the halls of Blackthorn Hall as Miss Marple descended the grand staircase, her steps light but purposeful. The other guests, roused from their rooms, gathered in the foyer, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion. Lady Eleanor, her composure fraying, stood by the open terrace doors, her hands clasped tightly. Hawkins, the butler, hovered nearby, wringing his hands and muttering about fetching the police. "Gone, you say?" Miss Marple's voice cut through the murmurs, calm and precise. "Mr. Drake has vanished entirely?" Hawkins nodded, his eyes wide. "I saw him step out for a cigarette, miss, not an hour ago. Then Miss Lang screamed, and when I ran out there was nothing, no sign of him, not even his cigarette case." Miss Marple's gaze swept the group. Sir Henry Ashford, his monocle glinting in the lamplight, frowned deeply. Mrs. Clara Wentworth clutched her silk shawl, her theatrical poise replaced by genuine unease. Dr. Lionel Gray stood apart, his medical bag already in hand, as if expecting a body to appear. Victor Crane, his face flushed, muttered something about "damned odd business," while Miss Sylvia Lang, pale and trembling, sat on a chair, fanning herself with a handkerchief. Edward Marsh, the solicitor, hovered near Lady Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "Let us be methodical," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "Hawkins, you saw Mr. Drake on the terrace at 10 o'clock. Miss Lang, you screamed at midnight. What prompted such a cry?" Miss Lang's eyes darted to the terrace doors. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice quavering. "I went to the window in my room. It overlooks the terrace. I saw something, a shadow moving quick." Authority drew them forward. She led the way to the terrace, a wide stone platform bordered by a low balustrade and flanked by neatly trimmed yews. The night was crisp, the moon casting long shadows across the flagstones. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. The others followed, their whispers hushed as if the night itself might overhear. "There," Hawkins pointed to a spot near the balustrade. "That's where he stood, smoking." Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the stone. The stone fire, a faint scattering of ash, marked the spot, but no cigarette case, no footprints, no sign of struggle. She straightened, her gaze moving to the lawn beyond, where the grass stretched unbroken to the distant woods. "No footprints," she murmured. "How curious. The ground is soft from yesterday's rain, yet there is no trace of Mr. Drake's departure." Dr. Gray stepped forward, his voice measured. "Perhaps he wandered off, lost his way in the dark." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "A man does not vanish in his own cigarette smoke, Doctor. And Mr. Drake did not strike me as a man prone to wandering." Sir Henry cleared his throat. "This is preposterous. A man doesn't just disappear. There must be evidence, something we've missed." "Quite so," Miss Marple said. "And we shall find it, Sir Henry, by looking where others do not." She turned to Hawkins. "Was the terrace door locked after Mr. Drake stepped out?" Hawkins hesitated. I believe so, miss. I locked it myself at 10:30, as is my habit." "Then how did Miss Lang see a shadow at midnight?" Miss Marple's question hung in the air, unanswered. She stepped back into the house, her eyes lingering on the heavy oak door, its brass lock gleaming faintly. The police arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Japp, a stout man with a brisk manner and a skeptical eye. He listened to the accounts, his notebook filling rapidly. "Right then," he said, addressing the group. "No one leaves the house until we've searched the grounds. Miss Marple, I understand you've a knack for noticing things. Care to join me on the terrace?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I should be delighted, Inspector." The search yielded little. The terrace remained stubbornly empty of clues. save for the ash, retired early, citing a headache. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face. Each alibi was tidy, plausible, yet something in the rhythm of their words, too quick, too slow, too rehearsed, set her little grey cells humming. She noted, too, the glances exchanged. Mrs. Wentworth's fleeting look at Victor Crane, Miss Lang's nervous fidgeting, Dr. Gray's studied calm. As Japp concluded his questions, Miss Marple spoke softly. "Inspector, might I suggest we secure Mr. Drake's room? There may be papers, letters, something to indicate why he stepped outside, or why someone wished him gone." Japp nodded, impressed despite himself. "Good thinking, Miss Marple. Hawkins, lead the way." Drake's room on the second floor was impeccably neat, as if its occupant had expected scrutiny. The bed was made, the wardrobe orderly, a single suitcase unpacked. On the desk lay a fountain pen, a notebook, and a silver cigarette case, curiously, not with him on the terrace. Miss Marple opened the notebook, her fingers delicate. A single page bore a scrawled note. "Meet me at 11:30. Urgent. E. E." Miss Marple murmured. "Eleanor, perhaps. Or Edward." She closed the notebook, her mind racing. The hour, 11:30, was half an hour after Hawkins locked the terrace door, yet before Miss Lang's scream. A timeline was forming, and with it, the first threads of a pattern. As the guests were dismissed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her eyes on the staircase. "A man does not vanish," she said to herself, "unless someone wishes him to. And in that wish lies the truth." Chapter 3. The Order of the House. The morning after Julian Drake's disappearance, Blackthorn Hall awoke to a heavy silence, broken only by the distant clatter of breakfast preparations. Miss Marple, having slept lightly, was already dressed in her neat tweed skirt and cardigan, her eyes bright with purpose. She descended to the dining room, where the guests gathered under the weight of unspoken questions. The chandelier, so resplendent the previous evening, now seemed to cast a pall over the table, where coffee and toast were served. Details. The small inconsistencies that betray the heart's secrets. Japp raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning instead to Lady Eleanor. "Lady Blackthorn, you mentioned a delicate matter last night. Care to elaborate? It might shed light on why Drake vanished." Lady Eleanor's cup clinked against its saucer. "It was a private concern," she said, her voice low. "A matter of family papers, nothing more. I intended to discuss it today, but with Mr. Drake gone—" She broke off, her eyes flickering toward Edward Marsh. The solicitor cleared his throat. "Perhaps, Lady Eleanor, it would be best to wait until the police conclude their search. We wouldn't want to complicate matters." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Marsh's tone was smooth, but there was a guardedness to it, as if he were shielding something, or someone. She turned her attention to the others. Sir Henry Ashford, buttering his toast, seemed preoccupied, his monocle catching the light as he glanced at Mrs. Wentworth. The actress, her makeup flawless despite the early hour, was unusually subdued, her fingers twisting a napkin. Dr. Gray, seated beside her, sipped his coffee in silence, his face a mask of professional calm. Victor Crane, however, was visibly agitated, his fork scraping against his plate as he muttered about wasted time. Miss Sylvia Lang, her eyes red-rimmed, stared out the window toward the terrace. After breakfast, Miss Marple requested permission to walk the grounds, ostensibly for fresh air. Japp, busy organizing a second search of the terrace, agreed, assigning a young constable to accompany her. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of merely strolling. She moved with purpose toward the terrace, her eyes scanning the balustrade where she had noticed the faint scratch the previous night. The constable, a lanky youth named Perkins, trailed behind. "Nothing much to see, ma'am," he said, scratching his head. "The lads went over this last night." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "But the morning light is so revealing, don't you think?" She knelt by the balustrade, her fingers tracing the scratch, a thin, shallow mark, no more than an inch long, but deep enough to suggest force. Nearby, embedded in a crack between the flagstones, she spotted a tiny glint of metal. Someone had rested there briefly. She made a mental note, her mind turning to the timeline. Drake had stepped out at 10. The terrace door was locked at 10:30, and Miss Lang saw a shadow at midnight. The cufflink suggested Drake had been on the terrace, but the absence of footprints was perplexing. Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out Hawkins, finding him polishing silver in the pantry. "Hawkins," she said, her voice gentle, "you locked the terrace door at 10:30, yes? Are you certain it remained locked?" Hawkins flushed, his hands pausing. I believe so, miss. I checked it myself before bed." "And yet," Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but probing, "Miss Lang saw a shadow at midnight. Could someone have unlocked the door after you?" Hawkins hesitated, then shook his head. "Not unless they had a key, miss. There's only two, one in my keeping, one with Lady Eleanor." Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. She then made her way to the library, where Edward Marsh was sorting through papers. The solicitor looked up, his expression wary. "Miss Marple, I trust you're not too unsettled by this business." "Not at all, Mr. Marsh," she replied, settling into a chair. "I find puzzles rather stimulating. Tell me, did you know Mr. Drake well?" Marsh's fingers tightened on a document. "Hardly at all. He was an acquaintance of Lady Eleanor's, I believe. Yet he was invited to this delicate discussion," Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively casual. "A man of independent means, I understand. Such men often have interesting histories." Marsh's smile was thin. "I wouldn't know, Miss Marple. My concern is Lady Eleanor's affairs, not Mr. Drake's." Miss Marple inclined her head, noting the solicitor's discomfort. As she left the library, she encountered Mrs. Wentworth in the hall, her eyes darting nervously. "Oh, Miss Marple," the actress said, her voice breathy. "This is all so dreadful. Poor Mr. Drake, do you think he's dead?" "That," Miss Marple said, "remains to be seen. But tell me, Mrs. Wentworth, did you notice anything unusual last night? A sound, perhaps, or a glance?" Mrs. Wentworth hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing, I'm afraid."
"Play." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the note in Drake's room. "Meet me at 11:30. Urgent. E." The initial, the locked door, the cufflink, the scratch, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Yet as she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, she felt the first stirrings of a pattern. Someone in Blackthorn Hall knew more than they admitted, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Chapter 4. The questions deepen. The late morning sun cast long shadows across Blackthorn Hall's drawing room, where Miss Marple sat, her knitting a quiet rhythm against the tension that hung in the air. Inspector Japp, having concluded his initial interviews, had set up a makeshift office in the library, and the guests were instructed to remain in the house while the police continued their search for Julian Drake. The atmosphere was one of uneasy confinement, with each guest casting wary glances at the others, as if expecting a revelation to erupt from the silence. Miss Marple, however, was not content to wait. She had requested permission to speak with each guest privately, a request Japp granted with a mix of amusement and respect. "You've a way of getting people to talk, Miss Marple," he'd said. "Just don't stir up too much trouble." "Trouble, Inspector?" Miss Marple had replied, her eyes twinkling. "I seek only clarity." Her first conversation was with Sir Henry Ashford, whom she found in the conservatory, examining a rare orchid with exaggerated focus. His monocle gleamed as he turned to her, his manner polite but guarded. "Miss Marple, I trust you're not too distressed by this affair." "Not distressed, Sir Henry," she said, settling onto a wicker chair. "Merely curious. You were reading in your room last night, I believe, when Mr. Drake vanished." Sir Henry nodded, adjusting his monocle. "Indeed, a volume of Gibbon, dry but absorbing. I heard nothing until Miss Lang's scream." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And you knew Mr. Drake well?" "Barely," Sir Henry said, his tone clipped. "Met him once or twice at Lady Eleanor's gatherings. A quiet fellow, kept to himself. Yet he was invited to this intimate gathering," Miss Marple mused. "A man of independent means, I understand. Such men often have connections." Sir Henry's jaw tightened. "If you're implying—" "Ask?" Mrs. Wentworth laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, just friends, Miss Marple. An actress's life is all correspondence, fans, producers, you know." "Indeed,"
Miss Marple said. "And you heard nothing unusual? No footsteps? No voices?" The actress hesitated, her fingers twisting a ring. "Nothing, I'm afraid. I was quite absorbed." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the ring, a heavy sapphire, worn on the right hand. "A lovely piece," she remarked. "A gift, perhaps." Mrs. Wentworth flushed. "From an admirer, long ago." She excused herself quickly, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the actress's nervous energy. Next, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Lionel Gray, who was in the billiard room, idly rolling a cue ball across the table. His calm demeanor was almost too perfect, Miss Marple thought, like a mask worn too long. "Dr. Gray," she said, "you were reviewing patient notes last night, yes? A dedicated profession, medicine." Gray nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "It requires focus, Miss Marple. I was in my room until the scream." "And Mr. Drake," she continued, "did you know him professionally? Perhaps he consulted you?" Gray's hand paused on the cue ball. "No, never. He seemed healthy enough from what I observed." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A doctor's eye misses little, I imagine. Did you notice anything about Mr. Drake at dinner? His manner, perhaps?" Gray frowned, as if weighing his words. "He was reserved, watched everyone, said little. I thought him preoccupied." Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, her mind cataloguing his measured responses. Victor Crane was next, found in the smoking room, his face drawn and his cigar unlit. He was less guarded, his agitation spilling over. "This is madness, Miss Marple," he burst out. "Drake vanishes, and we're all trapped here like rats. I've business in London, ruinous delays." "Business troubles, Mr. Crane?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I understand financial matters can be pressing." Crane's eyes narrowed. "Nothing I can't handle. But Drake, shady fellow if you ask me. Probably owed someone money and bolted." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Did he owe you money, Mr. Crane?" Crane flushed, waving a hand. Expected to see him. Miss Lang's cheeks reddened, but she said nothing, turning back to the window. Miss Marple left her, her mind turning to the note in Drake's room. "Meet me at 11:30. Urgent. E." The initial pointed to Lady Eleanor or Edward Marsh, but Miss Lang's reaction suggested another layer of connection. As luncheon was announced, Miss Marple joined the others, her eyes scanning the group. Lady Eleanor, attempting to maintain decorum, spoke little. Edward Marsh, ever attentive, hovered at her side. The others ate in near silence, the absence of Julian Drake a palpable presence. After the meal, Miss Marple slipped away to Drake's room, which Jap had left unlocked. She examined the notebook again, noting the pressure of the pen strokes, urgent, almost angry. The cigarette case, still on the desk, bore a faint scratch, similar to the one on the terrace balustrade. She opened it, finding a single cigarette, its tip slightly crushed, as if it had been held tightly. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Jap, who was reviewing his notes. "Anything new, Miss Marple?" he asked. She handed him the cigarette case, pointing out the scratch. "A small thing, Inspector, but perhaps significant. And the note, E, could be Lady Eleanor, but it could also be Edward Marsh. Have you questioned him closely?" Jap frowned. "Marsh says he was in the library working. No one saw him leave, but I'll dig deeper." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The cufflink, the scratch, the note, the locked door, all were threads in a tapestry, but the pattern remained elusive. As she resumed her knitting, her eyes followed Edward Marsh, who was whispering to Lady Eleanor. Something in their exchange, a glance, a pause, set her instincts alight. The truth, she felt, was close, hidden in the small human details of Blackthorn Hall. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Blackthorn Hall, casting a golden glow over the drawing room where the guests lingered after luncheon. The air was thick with unease, each person acutely aware of the empty space left by Julian Drake's disappearance. Inspector Jap, his patience fraying, had announced that the search of the grounds had yielded no new evidence, and his men were now combing the house. Flushed with irritation, was the first to break the silence. "This is intolerable," he declared, pacing before the fireplace. "Drake's probably halfway to London by now, laughing at us all. Why are we locked up here like criminals?" Mrs. Wentworth, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief, nodded vigorously. I agree, Mr. Crane. It's absurd to think one of us had anything to do with it. He must have run off. Perhaps he was in trouble, you know, debts or some scandal. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mrs. Wentworth's tone was too emphatic, her words too quick, as if rehearsed. Victor Crane's outburst, too, seemed calculated to draw attention. She glanced at Inspector Japp, who was scribbling in his notebook, clearly intrigued by the suggestion of Drake's flight. Debts, you say? Japp asked, looking up. Did either of you know Mr. Drake to be in financial trouble? Crane hesitated, then shrugged. I heard rumors, city talk, you know. Men like Drake, living on independent means, often have creditors snapping at their heels. Mrs. Wentworth nodded, her earrings glinting. Oh yes, I've known men like that, always charming, always borrowing. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression benign. And yet Mr. Drake left his cigarette case behind, a valuable item, one might think, for a man in debt. Curious, is it not? Crane's mouth opened, then closed. Mrs. Wentworth's smile faltered, and she busied herself with her handkerchief. Japp, sensing the shift, pressed further. Anyone else hear these rumors about Drake? Sir Henry Ashford, polishing his monocle, spoke up. I heard nothing of the sort. Drake seemed a gentleman, reserved but respectable. If he was in trouble, he hid it well. Dr. Gray, who had been silent, added, He appeared healthy, not distressed. But then some men conceal their worries expertly. Miss Marple noted the doctor's careful choice of words, as if he were measuring each syllable. Miss Sylvia Lang, seated near the window, said nothing, her eyes fixed on the terrace beyond. Lady Eleanor, attempting to maintain her role as hostess, offered more tea, but her hands shook as she poured. Japp, seizing on the debt theory, announced he would telephone London to check Drake's financial records. If he's bolted, we'll find him. In a hurried hand. Must be stopped. The risk is too great. E. The initial again. E. The same as the note in Drake's room. Miss Marple tucked the paper into her handbag, her mind racing. The fragment suggested urgency, perhaps fear, but its context was unclear. Was E the same person who had summoned Drake to the terrace? And why was this note discarded here, near the bush? Returning to the house, she sought out Hawkins, the butler, who was polishing the silver candelabra in the dining room. Hawkins, she said gently, you mentioned 2 keys to the terrace door, one in your possession, one with Lady Eleanor. Are you certain no one else could have accessed it? Hawkins frowned, his hands pausing. I keep mine in my room, miss, locked away. Lady Eleanor's is usually in her desk, but I couldn't say if anyone else knew where to find it. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to Edward Marsh. As Lady Eleanor's solicitor, he would have access to her study, perhaps her desk. She made her way to the library, where Marsh was sorting papers, his briefcase open beside him. Mr. Marsh, she said, her tone conversational. You were in the library last night, I believe, when Mr. Drake vanished. Did you hear anything? Perhaps the terrace door being unlocked? Marsh's pen paused, his eyes meeting hers briefly. Nothing, Miss Marple. I was absorbed in my work. Estate matters, you understand. Of course, she said, her smile disarming. And Mr. Drake, did he ever discuss Lady Eleanor's affairs with you? Marsh's expression tightened. He was a guest, nothing more. I had no dealings with him. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her instincts humming. Marsh's defensiveness, like Crane's bluster and Mrs. Wentworth's eagerness, felt deliberate. She returned to the drawing room, where Miss Lang was now alone, still staring at the terrace. Miss Lang, Miss Marple said softly, you seem troubled. Is there something you wish to share? The young heiress started, her eyes wide. I told you I saw a shadow, that's all. Miss Marple's gaze was kind but piercing. A shadow can be many things, my dear. A person, a memory, a fear. If you saw more than you've said, it might help Mr. Drake. Miss Lang's lips trembled, but she shook her head. I've told you everything. The drawing room, her knitting needles moving with steady precision as her mind sifted through the fragments of evidence. The cufflink, the scratched cigarette case, the note in Drake's room, and now the crumpled letter fragment marked with the ominous E. Each clue was a thread, but the pattern remained elusive, hidden in the subtle contradictions of human behavior. Inspector Japp returned from his telephone call to London, his expression grim. "No record of Drake owing debts," he announced to the guests, who had gathered reluctantly in the drawing room. "His finances are clean, surprisingly so, for a man of independent means. No creditors, no scandals. Makes his vanishing all the stranger." Victor Crane snorted, lighting a fresh cigar. "Clean finances don't mean a clean conscience. He's probably hiding from something, or someone." Mrs. Wentworth nodded, her sapphire ring glinting as she gestured. "Men like that always have secrets. Perhaps he crossed the wrong person." Miss Marple's eyes flickered between them, noting the ease with which they clung to the narrative of Drake's guilt. It was, she thought, a classic misdirection, like the village gossip in St. Mary Mead, who pointed fingers to deflect from her own misdeeds. She turned to Japp, her voice mild. "Inspector, have you considered the terrace door? If it was locked, as Hawkins claims, how could Mr. Drake, or anyone else, have passed through it after 10:30? Japp rubbed his chin. "That's the rub, Miss Marple. Hawkins swears he locked it, and Lady Eleanor confirms her key never left her desk. We've checked the lock, no signs of tampering. Yet a shadow moved at midnight," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to Miss Sylvia Lang, who sat pale and silent by the window. "Shadows, Inspector, do not move without cause." Japp frowned, but before he could respond, Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "If I may, I should like to examine the terrace door myself. A small detail, perhaps, but details are the heart of truth." Accompanied by Constable Perkins, Miss Marple made her way to the terrace. The heavy oak door, its brass lock gleaming, stood solid and unyielding. She ran her fingers along the frame, noting its tight fit, no gaps, no signs of force. The lock itself was a simple but sturdy mechanism, requiring a key from either side. Handkerchief, her mind racing. Paint suggested an object, perhaps a tool or a container, not typically found on a terrace. Hawkins arrived, his face etched with worry. "You wanted me, miss?" "Yes, Hawkins," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "You locked the terrace door at 10:30, but did you check it again before retiring?" Hawkins hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. I didn't, miss. I assumed it was secure. I went to bed soon after." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but probing. "And Lady Eleanor's key, where is her desk kept?" "In her study, miss, on the first floor. It's locked when she's not there, but—" He trailed off, flushing. "But?" Miss Marple prompted. "Well, Mr. Marsh sometimes uses the study. He's got a key, being her solicitor." Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts turning to Edward Marsh. The solicitor's access to the study, and thus the key, placed him at the heart of the mystery. She returned to the house, seeking out Lady Eleanor, who was in her private sitting room, her face pale as she stared at a photograph of her late husband. "Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair. "Forgive my intrusion, but the note found in Mr. Drake's room, 'Meet me at 11:30, urgent, E., suggests a connection to you. Did you ask him to meet you?" Lady Eleanor's hands tightened on the photograph. "No, Miss Marple, I did not. I barely knew Mr. Drake. He was a friend of my late husband's, invited out of courtesy." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. "And yet he was here for a delicate matter. Could it involve your husband's estate?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "There are documents, old family matters that needed discussion. Mr. Marsh was to handle it. Mr. Drake had some claim, or so he said." Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts returning to the letter fragment. "Must be stopped. The risk is too great. E. The same initial, the same urgency." She excused herself and sought out Edward Marsh, who was in the library, his briefcase open, papers neatly stacked. "Mr. Marsh," she said, her tone conversational, "you have access to Lady Eleanor's study."
So quick it might have gone unnoticed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The heiress's nervousness, her insistence on the shadow, suggested she knew more than she admitted. As evening approached, Japp gathered everyone to report no new findings. "We're treating this as foul play," he said. "Drake didn't leave on his own. No tracks, no witnesses. Someone in this house knows something. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, felt the weight of his words. The clue in the paint fleck, so small yet so telling, hinted at a physical act, a movement of something heavy, perhaps a body. The truth, she sensed, was not in the loud accusations, but in the quiet details, waiting to be unravelled. As twilight settled over Blackthorn Hall, the atmosphere grew heavier, the weight of suspicion pressing on every guest. The drawing room, once a place of polite conversation, now felt like a stage where each player hid behind a carefully crafted mask. Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, observed the subtle shifts in posture and glance, Mrs. Wentworth's restless fingers, Victor Crane's forced bluster, Miss Lang's averted eyes. The clues she had gathered, the cufflink, the scratched cigarette case, the note with E, the paint fleck, were beginning to form a pattern, but it was the human frailties, the lies half-spoken, that would reveal the truth. Inspector Japp, growing impatient, had called for another round of interviews, this time focusing on the guests' movements after dinner. Miss Marple, invited to sit in, listened intently, her needles clicking softly as Japp questioned Victor Crane. "Mr. Crane," Japp began, his tone sharp, "you say you were pacing your room over business matters. Can anyone confirm that?" Crane's cigar trembled slightly. "I was alone, Inspector. A man doesn't need a witness to pace his own room." "Convenient," Japp muttered, scribbling in his notebook. "And you heard nothing? No footsteps, no voices?" "Nothing," Crane said, his eyes darting to Mrs. Wentworth, who sat across the room, her face pale. Miss Marple's gaze followed his. "Mr. Crane," she said gently, "you mentioned Mr. Drake might have fled due to debts, yet his finances are sound. Could you have been mistaken, or perhaps referring to someone else's troubles?" Crane flushed, his voice rising. Hand froze, her eyes wide. I don't know what you mean." Before Japp could press further, Miss Sylvia Lang stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "This is absurd. Why are we all being interrogated? I saw a shadow, that's all I know. Why don't you ask Mr. Marsh about his late-night work? He was in the library, near the terrace door." All eyes turned to Edward Marsh, who sat stiffly, his briefcase at his feet. "Miss Lang," he said, his voice calm but edged. "I was organising papers, as I've said. I heard nothing, saw nothing." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Mr. Marsh, you have access to Lady Eleanor's study, where her key to the terrace door is kept. Did you enter the study last night?" Marsh's jaw tightened. "I did not, Miss Marple. My work was in the library." Lady Eleanor, who had been silent, spoke up, her voice trembling. "Miss Marple, I assure you my key was in my desk, locked. No one could have taken it." Miss Marple inclined her head, but her mind was racing. Miss Lang's outburst, meant to deflect, had instead drawn attention to Marsh, and to herself. The young heiress's nervousness, her quick accusation, suggested she was hiding something. Miss Marple recalled the small object Miss Lang had slipped into her pocket earlier, a gesture too furtive to be innocent. As Japp continued his questions, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need for fresh air. She made her way to the first-floor landing, where Miss Lang's room overlooked the terrace. The window was slightly ajar, its latch loose, as if it had been opened recently. Peering out, Miss Marple confirmed the view, a clear line to the terrace, where the balustrade and yew bush were visible. She examined the windowsill, finding a faint smudge of ash, not unlike the ash found on the terrace. Returning to her room, Miss Marple retrieved the crumpled letter fragment from her handbag. "Must be stopped. The risk is too great. E." She compared it to the note from Drake's room. "Meet me at 11:30. Urgent. E." The handwriting, though hurried, shared a distinctive loop in the E. She suspected they were written by the same hand, but the identity of E remained elusive. Lady Eleanor, Edward Marsh, or another. She rejoined the group in the drawing room, where Japp was concluding his interviews. Dr. Lyon, more than a shadow. Japp's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll have Perkins check it." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The lies were unravelling. Crane's bluster, Mrs. Wentworth's evasions, Miss Lang's deflection, Marsh's guardedness. The paint fleck, the ash, the notes, all pointed to a deliberate act, but the motive remained hidden. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lady Eleanor's mention of family papers and Drake's claim to the estate.
A financial motive, perhaps, or something deeper, a secret worth killing to protect. As the clock struck 8, a shout came from the hall. Constable Perkins burst in, holding a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "Found this in Miss Lang's room, sir," he said to Japp, "hidden in a jewellery box." It was a key, small, brass, identical to the one Hawkins had described for the terrace door. Miss Lang, standing nearby, gasped, her face ashen. "That's not mine," she cried. "Someone must have put it there." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The key was a breakthrough, but it also deepened the mystery. Who had placed it in Miss Lang's room, and why? Impassively by the bookcase. Then to Victor Crane, who was puffing nervously on his cigar. Miss Marple's needles paused. "Miss Lang," she said gently, "you mentioned seeing a shadow at midnight. Could you describe it again? Every detail matters." Miss Lang hesitated, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "It was quick, like someone running. I thought it was Mr. Drake, but it was too dark to be sure. I opened my window to look closer, and then nothing." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the ash on the windowsill. Had Miss Lang leaned out, perhaps dropping something, or had someone else been at her window? She turned to Japp. "Inspector, might we examine the jewellery box itself? Its contents may tell us more than the key alone." Japp, though skeptical, sent Perkins to retrieve the box from Miss Lang's room. As they waited, the tension in the room grew palpable. Mrs. Wentworth, her sapphire ring glinting, avoided Miss Lang's gaze, while Dr. Gray's calm demeanour seemed to harden, his fingers tapping lightly on his medical bag. Sir Henry Ashford polished his monocle with exaggerated care, and Edward Marsh remained silent, his eyes fixed on Lady Eleanor. When Perkins returned, he carried a small, ornate jewellery box, its velvet interior revealing a collection of trinkets, a pearl brooch, a silver locket, a pair of emerald earrings. Miss Marple, with Japp's permission, examined it closely. Tucked beneath a false bottom, she found a folded scrap of paper, its edges frayed. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a single line in the same hurried hand as the other notes. "He knows too much. E." A gasp rippled through the room. Miss Lang's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. "That's not mine either. I swear it." Japp's expression darkened. "Miss Lang, this is getting serious. 3 notes, all with the same initial, and now a key in your possession. What's your connection to Mr. Drake?" "I have none," she sobbed, collapsing into a chair. "I barely spoke to him, but—" She hesitated, her voice breaking. He asked me about my inheritance at dinner. He seemed to know something, about my family, my father's debts. I didn't think much of it then, but now—" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Miss Lang's admission, though partial, was a threat, not to Miss Lang alone, but to someone else in the house. The key, planted in her jewellery box, was a clumsy attempt to shift blame. But by whom? And why? As Japp ordered Miss Lang to remain under supervision, Miss Marple approached Lady Eleanor, her voice low. "Lady Eleanor, Mr. Drake's claim to your estate, could it involve Miss Lang's family, or perhaps another guest's?" Lady Eleanor's hands trembled. I don't know, Miss Marple. My husband left papers, unfinished business. Mr. Marsh was to clarify it all this weekend. Mr. Drake claimed a share, but he was vague, too vague." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to Marsh. The solicitor's access to the study, his guarded demeanour, and his proximity to Lady Eleanor made him a central figure. She sought him out in the library, where he was sorting documents, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Marsh," she said, her tone conversational. "The notes signed E. They could point to you, you know. Edward is a fine name." Marsh's pen paused, but his voice was steady. "A coincidence, Miss Marple. I wrote no notes, and I had no quarrel with Drake." "Of course," she said, her smile disarming. "But as Lady Eleanor's solicitor, you must know the details of Mr. Drake's claim. Was it substantial?" Marsh hesitated, then said, "It was complicated. Old debts, promises made by Lord Blackthorne. I advised Lady Eleanor to settle it quietly." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. The emotional weight of Miss Lang's breakdown, the discovery of the key, and the new note had shifted the investigation. The guests' lies were unraveling, exposing motives, debts, secrets, threats. The paint fleck, the ash, the scratches, all pointed to a physical act, perhaps a struggle, but the heart of the mystery lay in the human connections. Who stood to lose if Drake's knowledge was revealed? As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The truth was close, she felt, hidden in the interplay of fear and greed. Someone had acted to silence Drake, and the key in Miss Lang's room was a desperate attempt to obscure that act. But whose hand had placed it there? Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The atmosphere in Blackthorn Hall had grown taut as a violin string. The lack of a body or clear motive, gathered the guests in the drawing room after dinner. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the oak-panelled walls, and the chandelier gleamed with a cold, accusing light. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner, observed the group. Lady Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly. Edward Marsh, his briefcase never far from reach. Sir Henry Ashford, polishing his monocle with forced calm. Mrs. Wentworth, her sapphire ring catching the light. Dr. Gray, his professional mask intact. Victor Crane, puffing nervously on a cigar, and Miss Lang, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Japp began, his voice firm, "we're no closer to finding Mr. Drake, but this key and note suggest foul play. I'm convinced someone in this room knows more than they're saying. I propose a reconstruction of last night's events, here, now, to jog memories." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "An excellent idea, Inspector," she said, her tone mild. "But might I suggest a slight variation? Let us gather on the terrace at 10 o'clock, the hour Mr. Drake stepped out. A reenactment may reveal what words conceal." Japp hesitated, then nodded. "Right, Miss Marple. 10 o'clock on the terrace. Everyone be there." As the guests murmured their assent, Miss Marple watched their reactions. Mrs. Wentworth's hand trembled slightly. Victor Crane's cigar paused mid-puff. Edward Marsh's fingers tightened on his briefcase. Miss Lang's gaze darted to the terrace doors, and Lady Eleanor's face grew paler. Dr. Gray alone remained impassive, but Miss Marple noted a faint tightening of his jaw. At 10 o'clock, the group assembled on the terrace, the moon casting the same eerie light as the night before. Japp positioned Constable Perkins where Drake had stood, near the balustrade. "Right," Japp said. "Hawkins, lock the door as you did last night. Everyone else take your places as you were at 10. Hawkins, visibly nervous, locked the terrace door with his key. The guests stood in awkward silence, their breath visible in the chilly air. Miss Marple, standing near the yew bush, watched closely, her mind on the timeline. Drake's exit at 10, the locked door at 10:30, Miss Lang's shadow at midnight. She stepped forward. "This." She produced the paint fleck, held carefully in her handkerchief. A fleck of dark paint, found near the cufflink. Not from the balustrade, but perhaps from an object moved in haste. The group fell silent, their eyes darting to one another. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "And the key, found in Miss Lang's room, with a note, 'He knows too much,' suggests someone wished to incriminate her. But who had access to Lady Eleanor's study, where the second key was kept?" All eyes turned to Edward Marsh, who stiffened. "I resent the implication, Miss Marple. I was in the library, as I've said." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But let us test the timeline. Miss Lang, you saw a shadow at midnight. Could you show us where you stood?" Miss Lang, trembling, led them to her room, where the window overlooked the terrace. She pointed to the spot where she'd seen the shadow. Miss Marple examined the windowsill again, noting the ash. "Curious," she said. "This ash matches that on the terrace. Did you smoke, Miss Lang, or did someone else stand here?" Miss Lang's face crumpled. "I don't smoke. I don't know how it got there." Miss Marple nodded, her trap tightening. She turned to Japp. "Inspector, might we search the study? The second key's origin may tell us more." Japp agreed, and the group moved to Lady Eleanor's study, a small room lined with books and a heavy oak desk. The desk's lock was intact, but Miss Marple, with Japp's permission, opened it, revealing a neat stack of papers, and a small, dark-painted metal box, its edge scratched, matching the fleck from the terrace. Lady Eleanor gasped. "That's not mine." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Yet it was here, in a locked desk to which Mr. Marsh has a key." She opened the box, revealing a bundle of letters tied with string. The topmost bore the same handwriting, E. Marsh's face paled. I know nothing of this." Miss Marple's voice was soft but piercing. "Someone used this box, Mr. Marsh, to move something, or someone. The paint fleck, the scratch, the key, all point to a plan. And the notes suggest Mr. Drake knew a secret worth killing for." The room was silent. The guests
Had borne fruit. And now, with the evidence laid bare, the time had come to unravel the mystery of Julian Drake's disappearance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but commanding, "we have gathered the pieces of a puzzle, and now they must be fitted together. Mr. Drake did not vanish by chance, nor did he flee. He was removed, deliberately, methodically, because he knew a secret that threatened someone in this house." A murmur rippled through the group. Victor Crane's cigar trembled. Mrs. Wentworth's sapphire ring glinted as her hand shook, and Miss Sylvia Lang's eyes were wide with fear. Edward Marsh stood rigid, his briefcase clutched tightly, while Lady Eleanor's face was pale, her hands clasped around the photograph of her late husband. Sir Henry Ashford polished his monocle, and Dr. Gray's calm facade showed the faintest crack. Miss Marple held up the first note, found in Drake's room. "This note, meet me at 11:30, urgent, E. Lured Mr. Drake to the terrace. The second, found under the yew bush, must be stopped. The risk is too great, E. Revealed a motive. The third, in Miss Lang's jewelry box, he knows too much, E. Was meant to incriminate her. All bear the same handwriting, the same distinctive E." She turned to the metal box. "This box, found in Lady Eleanor's locked desk, bears a scratch matching the one on the terrace balustrade, and a fleck of its paint was found there. It was used to move something heavy, perhaps Mr. Drake himself. The cufflink, marked J, places him on the terrace, and the ash on Miss Lang's windowsill suggests someone was there, watching or acting." Japp nodded, his notebook open. "But where's Drake? And who's E?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Let us begin with the timeline. At 10, Mr. Drake stepped onto the terrace to smoke. Hawkins locked the door at 10:30. At midnight, Miss Lang saw a shadow and screamed. The note summoned Drake to meet E at 11:30, yet the door was locked. How, then, did the meeting occur?" She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "The answer lies in the key found in Miss Lang's room." Hands trembling. I knew nothing of this until recently. Mr. Marsh was to negotiate with him." Miss Marple nodded. "But Mr. Marsh had another motive. These letters also mention a third party, a witness to the debt. That witness, I believe, is among us." She turned to Dr. Lionel Gray, whose calm demeanor faltered. "Dr. Gray, you knew of this debt, did you not? You were Lord Blackthorn's physician and confidant." Gray's jaw tightened. I was aware of some financial matters, yes, but I had no reason to harm Drake." Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "Yet you were seen in the hall near the study at 11, by Hawkins, who hesitated to mention it. You had access to the key, and you wrote the notes, signing them E, not for Eleanor, but for Ego, a clever disguise of your own initials, Lionel Gray." The room fell silent, all eyes on Gray. He shook his head, but his hands betrayed him, clenching into fists. Miss Marple continued, relentless. "You lured Drake to the terrace, using the note. You unlocked the door with the study key, met him, and struck him, perhaps with the metal box, which you then hid in the study. The scratch on the balustrade, the paint fleck, the cufflink, all point to a struggle. You placed the key and note in Miss Lang's room to shift blame, knowing her financial troubles made her a plausible suspect." Gray's face paled. "This is preposterous. You have no proof." Miss Marple held up the letters. "The handwriting matches, Dr. Gray, and the ash on Miss Lang's windowsill came from your pipe. You smoked it while watching the terrace, ensuring Drake was alone. You killed him to protect your own secret. You had invested in Lord Blackthorn's venture too, and stood to lose everything if Drake exposed it. Grey staggered back, his mask crumbling. I didn't mean to kill him, he stammered. He was going to ruin us all, Eleanor, me, the estate. I only meant to scare him, but he fought and it happened so fast. Japp stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Dr. Lionel Grey, you're under arrest for the murder of Julian Drake. As Grey was led away, the guests stood in stunned silence. 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 The guests stood in stunned silence.
Lingering unease. Lady Eleanor, her composure barely intact, clutched the photograph of her late husband, her eyes distant. I never imagined, she murmured, that such a secret could lead to this. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost soothing. Secrets, Lady Eleanor, have a way of growing in the dark. Mr. Drake's claim, though legitimate, threatened more than your finances. It threatened the fragile balance of trust among those here. Japp nodded, his tone brisk but softened by respect. Miss Marple, you've done it again. That business with the notes, the paint fleck, the key, I'd have missed half of it. How'd you know it was Grey? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. It is not so much knowing, Inspector, as seeing. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I have observed that people are much the same, whether in a cottage or a grand hall. Dr. Grey's calm was too perfect, his answers too measured. The ash on Miss Lang's windowsill, the handwriting of the notes, the paint fleck matching the box, these were small things, but they pointed to a man who acted with precision, yet in panic. She paused, her needles clicking softly. Dr. Grey invested in Lord Blackthorn's failed venture, a fact he kept hidden. When Mr. Drake arrived, threatening to expose the debt and ruin both Grey and Lady Eleanor, he acted to protect himself. The notes, signed E for ego, were his attempt to mislead, to suggest another hand, perhaps Lady Eleanor or Mr. Marsh. The key in Miss Lang's room was a desperate ploy to shift blame, exploiting her known financial troubles. Miss Sylvia Lang, her face still pale, spoke up, her voice trembling. But why me? I barely knew Mr. Drake. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You were a convenient scapegoat, my dear. Your nervousness, your family's debts, Dr. Grey knew these would make you seem guilty. But your honesty, in admitting Drake's questions about your inheritance, helped reveal the truth. Victor Crane, his cigar extinguished, muttered, "Damned clever, planting that key. I thought Drake had just run off." Mrs. Wentworth, her sapphire ring catching the firelight, nodded. We all did. It's terrifying to think someone among us could do this.
But enough for those who look closely. Sir Henry Ashford, his monocle still, spoke quietly. And the body? Where is Drake? Japp answered, his tone grim. Grey's confessed to moving the body to the old well in the woods, hidden under brush. My men are retrieving it now. A collective shudder passed through the room. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice breaking. I must apologize to you all. This gathering, meant to resolve a private matter, has ended in tragedy. Miss Marple shook her head. You are not to blame, Lady Eleanor. The fault lies with those who let secrets fester. Truth, though painful, is a cleansing force. As Japp prepared to depart with Grey in custody, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her small figure commanding despite its modesty. Inspector, she said, I shall return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow. There are roses to tend, and village life, though quiet, has its own mysteries. Japp chuckled, tipping his hat. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. Scotland Yard could use you. She smiled, her eyes warm but sharp. Oh, I'm far too fond of my garden, Inspector. But I find that human nature, wherever it blooms, is much the same. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the terrace doors, her gaze on the moonlit balustrade where it had all begun. The truth had been found, not through luck or coincidence, but through the meticulous observation of small things, the scratches, the ash, the lies. She turned back to the house, her mind already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead.
where no doubt another puzzle awaited. Chapter 12. The Shadows of Motive. The morning following Dr. Gray's arrest dawned grey and heavy over Blackthorn Hall, the clouds mirroring the lingering unease among the guests. The discovery of Julian Drake's body in the old well, as confirmed by Inspector Japp's men, had brought a grim finality to the mystery, yet questions remained. Miss Marple, seated at the breakfast table with her tea and toast, observed the subdued group with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a silent companion to her thoughts, which now turned to the deeper motives that had driven the crime. Lady Eleanor, her face drawn, presided over the meal with a strained attempt at normal motive. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen quarrels over far less that led to great harm because the heart was wounded. Dr. Gray's fear was not just of financial ruin, but of losing his place in the world, his reputation, his control. Mr. Drake's claim threatened to expose him as a man who had gambled and lost, not just money, but trust. She sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to Lady Eleanor. And there was another shadow, a personal one. Dr. Gray's loyalty to Lady Eleanor, perhaps more than professional, made him desperate to protect her from scandal. Lady Eleanor's cup clinked against its saucer, her eyes wide. "Miss Marple, you cannot mean—" "I mean only what the evidence suggests," Miss Marple said gently. "The letters in the box showed Dr. Gray's investment was tied to your husband's venture, but his actions, the notes, the murder, were driven by a need to shield you as well as himself. He saw Mr. Drake as a threat to your honor and his own." Edward Marsh, his briefcase at his side, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, you mentioned the handwriting. How were you so certain it was Gray's?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The E in the notes had a distinctive loop, Mr. Marsh. I compared it to a prescription Dr. Gray wrote for Lady Eleanor, found among the study papers. The match was unmistakable. Small things, you see, reveal great truths." Mrs. Wentworth, her sapphire ring glinting, spoke softly. "It's dreadful to think he watched us all, planning this. And poor Miss Lang, nearly blamed for it." Miss Lang, her composure somewhat restored, nodded. "I still don't understand why he chose me." Miss Marple's voice was kind. "You were vulnerable, my dear. Your family's debts, which Mr. Drake probed at dinner, made you a plausible suspect. Dr. Gray placed the key in your jewelry box, knowing it would draw suspicion. But your honesty and the ash on your windowsill cleared you. Someone else, Dr. Gray, stood at your window, smoking his pipe, watching the terrace. Victor Crane, his cigar unlit, muttered, 'Clever devil, almost got away with it.' Sir Henry Ashford, adjusting his monocle, added, 'But the body, why hide it in the well?' Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "I shall settle Mr. Drake's claim as my husband would have wished. The scandal is less painful than the truth remaining hidden." Miss Marple nodded, her expression approving. "A wise choice. Secrets, left buried, only grow thorns." As the guests prepared to leave Blackthorn Hall, their bags packed and their alibis no longer needed, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her eyes on the terrace doors. The mystery was solved, but its echoes remained, a reminder of how fragile trust could be, how easily fear could turn to violence. She gathered her knitting, her mind already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead, where the roses awaited, and human nature, as always, would provide its own puzzles. Chapter 13. The Unseen Threads. The departure of Inspector Japp and Dr. Gray left Blackthorn Hall in a state of quiet disarray, as if the grand estate itself exhaled after holding its breath. The guests, preparing to leave, moved through the halls with subdued steps, their bags packed, but their minds still entangled in the events of the past days. Miss Marple, her own modest suitcase ready, lingered in the drawing room, her knitting needles silent for once. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the terrace doors, now firmly locked, stood as a mute reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Lady Eleanor, her composure strengthened by the resolution of the mystery, approached Miss Marple, her eyes reflecting gratitude and lingering sorrow. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I cannot thank you enough. Without your insight, we might have lost more than Mr. Drake, our very souls, perhaps, to suspicion and fear. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her blue eyes sharp yet kind. "You are too generous, Lady Eleanor. In St. Mary Mead, I have learned that truth, though painful, heals more than it harms. Your guests, I suspect, will carry this lesson with them." As Lady Eleanor nodded, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the remaining guests, who were gathering their coats in the foyer. Sir Henry Ashford, his monocle tucked away, seemed older, his usual bluster softened by the weight of events. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, her theatrical flair muted, adjusted her hat with a nervous hand, her sapphire ring catching the light. Victor Crane, his cigar absent, muttered about catching the next train to London. Miss Sylvia Lang, though still pale, held her head higher, fingers tightened on her handbag. He knew about my father's debts," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "He offered to help, but I didn't trust him. I thought he wanted something in return." Miss Marple nodded, her expression compassionate. "And you were wise to be cautious. Men like Mr. Drake often wield knowledge as a weapon. But you must not let fear define you, my dear. You have strength enough to face your troubles." Miss Lang's eyes glistened, but she managed a small nod. As she turned to join the others, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letters in the metal box, the root of the tragedy. She sought out Edward Marsh, who was conferring with Lady Eleanor about the estate's papers. "Mr. Marsh," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "the letters revealed much, but I wonder if there are other documents, perhaps ones you hesitated to share, that might clarify Mr. Drake's full intentions." Marsh's face tightened, but he met her gaze. "Miss Marple, I assure you, I've given Lady Eleanor all relevant papers. Drake's claim was legitimate, but it was complicated by other parties." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Other parties, Mr. Marsh? Such as Dr. Gray, perhaps, or even yourself?" Marsh flushed, his voice low. "I had no stake in the venture, Miss Marple. My role was to protect Lady Eleanor's interests." "Of course," she said, her smile disarming. "But protection can take many forms, can it not? A solicitor's loyalty is a powerful thing." As Marsh excused himself, Miss Marple's mind turned to the broader tapestry of the case. Dr. Gray's act of murder had been driven by fear, of ruin, of exposure, of losing Lady Eleanor's trust. Yet the other guests, each with their own secrets, had contributed to the atmosphere of suspicion. Mrs. Wentworth's evasions, Crane's bluster, Lang's vulnerability, Marsh's guardedness, all had woven a web that allowed Gray's plan to unfold. She joined Lady Eleanor in the study, where the metal box still sat on the desk. "Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple said, "you intend to settle Mr. Drake's claim. A noble choice, but I advise you to examine all the letters carefully. There may be other claims, other threads yet to unravel." Lady Eleanor nodded, her resolve. The heart would linger, a reminder of the delicate balance between truth and trust.